once again, we are back for the last chapter in this particular series as we wrap up the albums of Classix, Nouveaux, and Sal Solo out on his own. Kind of a crossover album, I would say, between Classix, Nouveaux, and a solo artist. And Sal Solo's here. Hello, Sal.
Well, you made it sound like my funeral, and it's like the final chapter, and here I am to witness it.
The final chapter in this series. Who knows what I'll get you to agree to do next. But Heart and Soul, I guess, like we did on Secret, let's just start with the album cover. I'm curious about the image on that album.
Oh, okay. Well, the people from Poland, they will recognize this image very well. I think in the last episode, we talked about when we went to Poland, first of all, and became this huge hit household name. And so we developed a great affinity for Poland, and they developed a great love of us. And it was really like a special relationship. So one of the things about Poland that's interesting, when you go and visit the various museums, art galleries, and so on, you discover that they're historically a very creative people, a very artistic people, but they suffered from their geography because they're right smack dab in the center of Europe. So every empire and army that ever wanted to conquer, they always conquered Poland or attacked them. And so at this particular time, there was a Swedish army, I think, trying to conquer Poland. And they have this big castle on a hill. It's called Jasna, I think. And so the armies, Swedish armies, were surrounding Jasna and trying to besiege it. And in Jasna, there is an icon. I don't know how old it is, but they call it a Black Madonna. And so I guess they prayed, and somehow or other the Swedish armies did not manage to capture it. And so it's a great kind of icon of national success and unity and victory over their enemies. And so I think I really chose that picture because of the great relationship with Poland.
See, and I always looked at it thinking it was an image from the Crusades.
Well, it's not so different, but except that it was in a different era and a different place, but it's the same.
Right, other than being totally not.
well, because I'm trying to be generous here and help me out. And, but, we don't want people to know about your ignorance. You're a PBS presenter.
They know now.
You're supposed to know about stuff, right? And so, it's in that shrine, castle, whatever you want to call it, monastery, I think it actually is. They still have this Black Madonna, and it has 3 scars on its cheek. And so I'm not sure whether that was the Swedish army or some other army, but every time they tried to invade and conquer Poland, they never managed to actually capture this place. It's on a very steep hill. And some years after this album, I was playing there for some kind of a national youth event. And it was really very weird because I was stuck right on the top of the castle and all the people were down below. And so they were kind of waving at me from a distance. And it was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had in performance.
All right, now we're going to take you back. So here we go. Secret is out. You're touring with Secret. You've also talked about starting to have an awakening in yourself, having gone to India. You're starting to realize, if I'm remembering where we left off in the last one, that all of this fame and success is not giving you the satisfaction you thought it would give. There's something more here that you're looking for.
Yeah, I think that since I was about 12 years old, I always thought if I could become a pop star and be on TV and make records and tour around the world, have loads of people at my concerts, that would be all I would ever want from life. And having achieved all of those things, I realized it was not at all all it was cracked up to be. And so whereas some people, when they become successful, they go off on the drugs or other indulgence or self-destruction. And I kind of went on I guess you might call it a pilgrimage of investigation or searching. And when I found what I was looking for, I wasn't really trying to ram it down everybody's throat. I remember one time in Poland, actually, when we were touring and I was reading a book. I don't know whether it was the Bible or some other spiritual book. And one of the guys in the band came walking down the bus and saw me. He said, "What are you reading?" And I told him, and he said, "Oh, that's great. I hope it happens to me one day." And so that was really the nature of my investigation.
Yeah. At this point, do you know that Classix Nouveau's record deal is canceled?
Yes, very soon after Secret was released, we got the news that EMI was dumping us. And so right away, Jimmy, the guitarist, went back to Finland and BP decided to do something else. But we had tours booked. And so I quickly recruited some other musicians to step in. And so we went about doing the tours. And
So go on.
well, we went about doing the tours, and I think we genuinely thought we're just going to do some new material, and we're going to look for a new record deal for Classix Nouveaux. Now, the one thing about that is, I mentioned before, studio time was very, very expensive back then, and when EMI dropped us, we lost our income. And so it was tough to be able to really record it up to a high standard. But I had some good musicians and we had these new songs. So we recorded 3 or 4 songs, thinking this would be the 4th Classix Nouveaux album.
Yeah. You're writing for Classix Nouveaux. You're changing yourself. I'm curious if you're noticing, even in the material you're writing for Classix, a different voice, a different perspective.
I think there was definitely a difference there. In myself, I guess I was kind of less angry, and so I was kind of changing into a more mellow, contented kind of person. So there was that, but at the same time, both then and now, I was always very aware that this was my personal journey, and I wasn't going to force anybody else to come on that journey, particularly the members of my band. And so if we were doing something as a band, I was going to represent them. So that would be all of us, not just me.
Help me with the timeline here. So when is it that you're touring with Classix and writing new Classix material? When is it you go to San Damiano? When is it you write San Damiano? And when is it you're putting the album together? Are they happening all concurrently, or is there an order to this?
I believe the last Classix album, Secret, was released in December of '83. Mm-hmm. So that suggests to me they must have released a couple of singles that they did early in '84. And so I'm guessing we're probably somewhere around the spring or the middle of '84 when we're finally cut from EMI. I went to San Damiano on my pilgrimage at the end of '83, October '83. So it must have been when we'd finished recording Secret, but before it was released. So that would be the timeline.
So the awakening you're having to then realize your perspective is changing, that's happening while you're touring with Classix then. So you're out there doing the material from before as you're evolving yourself.
Well, you alluded to the fact that India was significant in my journey, and that was around the time that we were promoting our second album, La Vérité, and so I'm thinking that must have been probably later in '82, and so from sometime maybe towards the end of '82, right through '83, I was exploring my future direction.
And I guess what I'm trying to get at here is trying to figure out, when do you sit down and put your thoughts into music with San Damiano? And where does it fall in thinking about a 4th Classix album? And I'm trying to figure out how this plays out, because that song, as we'll come to talk about, very different, big production, hit for you. It's a whole different type of sound. And I'm just curious how that comes to be.
I think the San Damiano song was recorded later in '84. And so by that point, the version of Classix that existed was not the EMI version. And so things had already changed. I probably wrote the song in its the nucleus of the song late in '83 when I got back from my first pilgrimage there, but didn't do anything with it until later.
So how does it come to be that you folks sign to a new album, to a new label, and set about working on this album as a Sal Solo album, as opposed to a Classix Nouveaux album?
Well, I think we better start in the track listing to bring us to that.
Okay.
Because because it starts off with the new Classix Nouveaux.
Okay. So the first song on the album, according to the track listing I have, is Heartbeat.
Heartbeat was one of the songs that we recorded as the new Classix Nouveaux. And so on the album, that one, along with 2 or 3 others, is listed, I think, like Sal Solo with Classix Nouveaux. Although it was not the Classix Nouveaux that we knew, really,
Right.
because this was the new touring version of Classix Nouveaux. So the musicians were a bit more polished than the musicians we had before. They'd been session guys, some of them had been making commercials and so on. So they were very capable of playing anything in a very professional style. One of the kind of uniting factors was you can still hear the Indian percussion from Pandit Dinesh, who joined us on the Secret album, and I always liked his groove so much that I kept him around as long as I was pretty much recording. But when I listened to this, what actually jumped out at me above everything else was the bass, because the bass player I had at this time, he was a young guy called Kevin Powell, and he'd been doing sessions with a lot of well-known English artists. And he just had a sound and a groove which I've never matched. See, to me, out of all of music history, the best bass lines came from Chic, you know, Say Chic, and what were the other songs they did now? Freak Out and things like that.
Yeah.
Or they did that Diana Ross, Upside Down, and all those things. And so the bass becomes a kind of funky rhythm thing. And so it's not so much as being a secondary lead guitar or showing off or anything like that. It's just making a song move. And so I just absolutely loved the way this guy played. And not only that, but his sound. You know, his sound is very distinctive. And I still marvel over how you can get 4 fat strings and a lump of wood and make it sound completely different to nearly everybody else that plays that instrument. So for me, that's the highlight of this song, is the bass groove, together with the Indian percussion.
So now, are you recording this in a session for an album, or are you guys doing songs here and there?
I'm sure that we started it as a demo for a new record deal. Once I actually had the record deal, we may well have revisited or did some overdubs or something like that and improved it, but definitely it began as a new Classix demo.
Okay, I'm going to go back to this question then, and you say as soon as you had the record deal. So the record deal is coming about for you or for Classix Nouveaux?
I'm going to keep you waiting on that one until we reach San Damiano, because I think I'll have nothing to say about that song if I keep giving it all away before. So if you're going to go chronologically, in the songs, then it would begin with San Damiano. But since you're going the way that they are on the album, we've got to wait a little bit for some of the explanations.
Okay, then let's throw out track listing and go to when these things happened and how, because I think this is more of an organic album than the earlier three. And so let's say you come back from San Damiano, you sit down to put your thoughts down in song. Take me through that.
All right, then, you're determined to have your way, so I'll go along with you. As I mentioned, the San Damiano song, I must have written probably towards the end of '83. Actually, I went to San Damiano originally with Nick Beggs, who used to at that time be in Kajagoogoo. And because we both had a great faith experience there, my original idea was to do it with him. And I guess Kajagoogoo was still riding very high at that time. It wasn't that long ago they'd had their big hit. And so it didn't quite work out to do it with him. So I kind of had it in my back pocket. Then one day, my manager said to me, there's a new show starting up on the BBC, rock gospel, and they have choirs and such. Maybe you want to do something. And I was brought up as a Catholic, and so I didn't know about black gospel and all of that except for Oh Happy Day. And so to me, a choir suggested like boys in gowns and that heavenly sound. And plus, because I'd had this new faith experience, that was kind of what was floating around in my heart and soul, was this angelic kind of experience. So I presented this song that I'd written, San Damiano, to do with a choir. And so they hooked me up with this boys' choir in London. And I'd mentioned before that at that time in England and on TV, they had some kind of a union, musicians union rule that you could only have 3 hours to record something before a TV show. And so we got our 3 hours, and the choir boys show up at the studio, and their director says, all right, let's gather around the choir. And he starts playing my song, and they start chiming in. And I thought I was in heaven. It's like, wow, the angels have arrived at my studio. And so there was basically just them. There was Pandit Dinesh on the percussion, and there was me with my guitar and my drum boxes and stuff. And so we finished it in 3 hours. And we one of the interesting things was, I remember the engineer at the end of the session, he said, shall we mix it in mono or stereo? Because TVs were usually mono at that time. And I said, well, let's just do it in stereo. So we did the TV series, show. It was successful, and that was it. And so then my manager, Falcon, afterwards is, well, what do you want to do with this? And I said, I'd like to release it as a single. And he said, well, I don't know if it's really commercial, but we can wait till Christmas because it sounds a bit Christmassy. So later that year, he went around to the record companies with the recording that ended up, the exact recording actually, that ended up being the single. And that was that.
Okay, so he goes around to the record companies and there's interest. Is this where they give you the contract, or is it just like they like the single, they want to take you on for the single, or do they say, we like the single, we want an album from you?
Well, usually there's really two types of record contracts. And so you get the minimum commitment from a record company, which might be one, or they call it options. So you do one, and then if they decide they'll do another one, they'll do another one, and maybe a future album, something like that. And so I think we probably did a deal initially just for a single or two, because I only had this one song that was unlike everything else. So I wasn't really thinking ahead about what would happen with it. We got offers from 3 record companies for it. And when we accepted the deal with the company that we wanted to go with, of course, it became a top 20 hit in England and #1 in Poland. And it was one of my most successful things I've ever done. But the weird part about it was, once we had the record company in the deal, we tried to make it better, and we never could. We did all kinds of remakes and remixes, and we ended up just going with the original TV. I think we bought it off the BBC actually for a few $100, because it just somehow had the magic that we couldn't recreate.
So what does that teach you about recording?
Well, it's that debate I've referred to before between perfection and I don't know, the human touch. I guess it had the spontaneity, the excitement, and the human touch.
How quickly does it rise in the charts? How quickly is this song a hit?
I would say very quickly, because first of all, they have a tradition in England which is different to here in the States, because in the States we don't have so much in the way of Christmas hits. Usually people plan their Christmas albums way ahead, and so they're just seeing all the dollar signs for the Christmas season. In England, they have a tradition where I don't know if it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks or something before Christmas, you'll only then start to see what's coming out for Christmas, and whatever is the Christmas big #1 song is going to be a all-time classics. That year it was Last Christmas.
Last Christmas.
Last Christmas, I Gave You My Heart. And actually, so George Michael was #1 in the charts. So that Christmas I was about number 15. And I remember we met in the restaurant of the BBC, and he said to me, I was looking at some old Top of the Pop shows last night, and you were on one of them. And I had this image in my mind of a young George Michael looking up at the screen and seeing people like me saying, one day I'm going to be there, and I'm going to be like that.
So I guess let's talk a little bit about what you wrote in San Damiano. Very opening of who you are, very autobiographical, I feel. Different for you to be exposed in this song, or because you now have had the experience you've had, it's important to share for you?
Well, first of all, it was my personal experience. And this is why I was recording it in my name, and why I got a deal in my name, because it represented my journey. It did not represent the band. I still had a version of Classix Nouveaux at that time, and I was very aware that that was something different. It was a different group of people. It was really a different group of fans. And so I didn't know where I was going, but all I knew was this is about me. This is not about the band. And so I was essentially just trying to express that there had been a change in me. Even before this was released, it was really odd that people at the record company would come and tell me their problems or something. So it was like, it touched a note. There's a little taste of heaven somehow in that, and higher things in that song. And so all really I was saying in it at the time was, I've been to this place and it was great. You should go and try it too. That was essentially the message of that song. But it was part of it. The original idea was based on a traditional Latin hymn, which they sing in San Damiano. And so that's probably why it's got that kind of, traditional hymn-like quality to it, really.
Yeah. Since we're going for all the nuts and bolts here, the reaction from the band while this success is happening for you, is that making things difficult? Is it seen as, wow, it's a lifeline for the band because now that you're getting notoriety too, it puts them back in the spotlight? What's the reaction going on?
I don't think anybody knew. None of us knew what was going to happen. And so we were just going about our business. We were going to Poland and doing our tours, and we were going to Spain and other places. And so I don't know that it was really a factor one way or another. They probably did think, well, it was good that I had a hit. I remember actually visiting with Mick one day around the time it was a hit, and he was quite happy for me, I guess. So there wasn't really any tensions caused by this, if that's, what you're suggesting.
Not even sure if it's tensions, but I'm wondering if when the lead singer has the solo career, what it does to the band, and is the band, but now you've already kind of reconstructed the band a bit at this point anyway. And I'm just kind of curious that evolution within them, and also for you. And then it's like, okay, so you have this top 20 hit. Is Classix Nouveaux performing a version of it when you're in tour, or are you keeping the whole thing separate?
I used to do a kind of unplugged version of this, so that when we got to the middle of the show, they would all disappear for a little bit, and then I would have my little San Damiano moment. That was,
Yeah.
I couldn't bring in the boys choir, so that was the best I could do.
Okay, so you have this, it's a hit. Record company now is saying, we want an album or no?
Yes.
Okay.
That inevitably happens. If you got a hit, then they think, okay, we could sell an album. And so in a way, this did signal the demise of Classix Nouveaux, because they were yesterday's news and I was today's thing. I was the new thing.
Right.
And particularly because it was really a fairly different audience. You know, Classix was this kind of somewhat left field rock band, maybe even a little scary. And here was me with a boys choir singing this happy hymn-like sound. And so suddenly all the old grannies like me, you know.
Does the label want, though, a whole album of San Damiano's, or are they wanting variety? Or they want, what are your orders? I can think of a better word. What are they expecting from a Sal Solo album now that San Damiano's a hit?
For better or for worse, I've never really had an A&R man from a record company who really interfered much in the music, okay, or manager for that matter. And so the reason I say for better or for worse is I've made some bad decisions, but they were my decisions, so I have to live by them. So yeah. I don't know that there's any expectation other than selling records, really. You know, we've sold a lot of records on this one, so maybe we can sell a lot more in the future. That's their interest in the whole project.
Okay, then for you, what are you thinking this album's going to feel like?
I think I just didn't know. Since probably 5-6 years earlier, I'd never really thought of myself other than the singer of Classix Nouveaux. And so now I was suddenly going to be on my own. It wasn't something I ever particularly desired. And so I was working it out as I went along. Like, here's the inspiration, let's try a bit of this. And so on the one hand, we had these 3 or 4 songs we'd done with the new version of Classix. So I thought, well, I'm not going to waste them. I'm going to put them on my album. But they were unlike the other things that I was doing just on my own. It was really a big experiment, I think.
You mentioned Heartbeat. Do you know what the other ones were the classic songs?
Yeah, there's Poland, there's Shout, and there's Contact. They were the other ones.
Okay, let me take you back then to the track listing. So we talked a bit about Heartbeat. Poland, we know your affinity to Poland.
Poland, your spirit won't die. One day we'll stand side by side. Your faith has carried you by. Poland, your spirit won't die.
Talk to me about writing that song.
I mentioned, I think, in the previous episode that Poland at that time was still communist. And so they were completely oppressed. They were really suffering. In the shops, they had hardly anything to sell. There were lines outside a bakery to buy a loaf of bread each day. And at the same time, as I told you, they had this great history of art and creativity, so that they were a great people. And I would go to church often in the morning when I'm touring in Poland, and there'd be a bunch of old ladies dressed in black, and they would sing hymns with no instruments. They would just start singing in a real broken voice that sounded like suffering to me. And so the lines of this song are very, very important. Poland, your spirit won't die, and that's for sure, because of all the countries that were forced into the USSR, they were the ones that most of all did not give in. And so even they were controlled and they were oppressed and everything else, but they were always determined they were going to be Polish, and one day it was not going to be like this. So Poland, your spirit won't die. One day we'll stand side by side. So in other words, you will be free like us.
Yeah.
That was the shared hope. So I'd have to say, on the day, first of all, when the Iron Curtain came down, you know, the Berlin Wall came down, that was a great moment, because I thought of what this song said. And then later on, when Poland joined the EU, the European Community, they're equal to all of us, all the other European countries. So in a sense, you could say what I wrote, what I aspired to, came to be.
Is it risky, though, to record that song to that audience in those days? Are you
Yes.
worried that they're going to crack down and say, okay, no more Classix Nouveaux over here. This is getting a little bit much.
Well, I had to draw the line somewhere. One day when I was playing somewhere, they said, would you like to meet Lech Wałęsa? He's down the road. And I said, I think I maybe better not go that far. That might just be a little bit crossing the line.
Yeah. Are you, though, thinking politically about a song like this? Because people may not remember the tensions that are there, especially with the idea of this desire for independence, which eventually leads to where we are today, but that these kind of songs may seem wonderful rally calls today, are seen as dangerous in those days. Are you thinking in terms of that? And is it a message to them for hope, or is it sharing to the world what you've experienced with them?
I think that you're right. It's risky. The first country that we ever played in a stadium and earned a silver disc was the former nation of Yugoslavia. And in Yugoslavia, there were tanks on the streets. Now, they were not active tanks, they were not operative, but they were left over from the various wars that went on. And subsequent to that, of course, they had their own civil wars where it broke up into 3 different countries. So we'd been in war zones before, and we were definitely aware that you're taking risks every time you say anything that's going to challenge the communist government. One time I was brought there supposedly to sing for Pope John Paul, who was visiting. And when I arrived, I was told I'd been blacked out of the program. And so I had to just stay in my hotel and look out the window. So they were very strange times for sure. But, you know, we had a great deal of love for our fans and vice versa. And so this was really between me and the fans above everything else. I'm not sure the rest of the world hearing it would have understood so much what was going on in Poland, but the Polish people definitely knew what I was saying.
Performing it live in concert for that audience, did you have that opportunity, and what was that like?
Yeah, well, it's kind of like a new national anthem of freedom, really. And
yeah.
So, it's one of my favorite things I've ever done, really, to be able to do that.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, moving on. Shout.
Shout and tell us what it's all about. Shout and tell us what it's all about.
What are you shouting about, my friend?
I'm shouting about my new awakening, and a couple of things about this song which are interesting. First of all, I mentioned the rock gospel show on BBC television. Well, in England, there are not very many celebrities who become Christian. There are very, very few. There's a little sort of Christian subculture. So I was one of the only really famous people that was willing to go on a show like that. And so they were inviting me on all the time, you know, every few weeks I was on there. And so now I was being introduced to the black gospel choirs. Having done the boys choir thing, now I was into the black gospel. So they, first of all, took me to a black church in London with a sort of grandma type who ran the whole thing. And she was holding court. So they took me in and she says, I don't like your song. Can you choose another? So we came out, and with the producer, you know, he said, all right, I think I know a choir that's a bit more kind of up to date than them. And they're called the London Community Gospel Choir, LCGC, and they've made their own records and everything. In fact, the leader of the choir, since then, he's received an honor from the Queen. I think he's an MBE or something like that. We're still in touch. And so Shout was one of the first songs that I ever worked with them on. And I just loved their sound. You know, most people don't really know black gospel music in England too much. And so just to have the beat and the Indian percussion and then the gospel choir going, it was fantastic. And so there was a lot of joy, there was a lot of faith. And so we were shouting it out. That's what we were shouting about.
Are you feeling like a kid in a candy store again with this album?
I think that's a good description, actually, yeah, because I was on my own. I could do anything I wanted in the world. I didn't have to convince anybody else. I was the decision maker. And so I made some, as I mentioned, some good decisions and some really bad decisions.
Yeah. Do you like being in that position? Having come from a band, some people love the structure of a band and bouncing ideas, and other people want to forge out on their own with their own creativity. Where naturally do you tend to fall?
I think generally it's better to have a team because they might save you from making some really bad mistakes, so, making a fool of yourself. Plus also, if you make music for yourself, I've known some people who do that, although they think it's for the public. And I've had to say to somebody, well, you enjoy this so much, maybe this music is just for you or for your mother, And so if you're making music just for yourself, it doesn't matter. But if you're making music to try and touch other people's hearts, then if 4 or 5 people agree this is touching me, then there's more chance it's going to touch 4 or 500, 4 or 5,000, 4 or 5 million.
Back to the album, San Damiano is next on the track listing. And as we talked about before, it's going to end the first side. And so you've got a structure there. Does the song sound different to you or feel different now that it's in a grouping of songs as opposed to being a little gem on its own?
Well, this album is very, very eclectic. And so in a way, anything can fit in this album and did. So I don't think it kind of was uncomfortable in any way. I think because of being a hit, we were able to do some other mixes. There are some extended mixes. I think there's a mix where it's just more or less the choir, which is beautiful. And I love to be able to hear all those parts. At that time, I didn't know how to arrange voices like that. Now I do. I can appreciate it even more. And in fact, I've learned a lot of my arranging from the gentleman who did this arrangement. And back then, they didn't have computers for doing stuff. So he had to write all the notes out by hand. So I really think he's a genius as far as that kind of thing goes. He did tell me many years later that he became a Catholic because of me. And so that's kind of interesting. I'm wondering, what did I say or do, that kind of touched his face?
At this point, are you seeing your music as a ministry now, or is it still pop music you're putting out?
Well, I was still very much in the mainstream of music at that time. I didn't even know about Christian music and a Christian music scene because the kind of churches that I grew up in, all the music was ancient or boring or both. And so I didn't feel I was part of that. And as far as I knew, I was just going to continue with mainstream record companies and appearing on TV and doing all the things I'd always done, except it wasn't going to be with a band.
All right, we're flipping the album over. First song, second side, Music and You.
My life has music and you, but now I know if I had to choose between you, I'd have to go without the melody.
I have a relationship with this song. I remember specifically, now here in the States, we don't know what's going on with Sal Solo. We know there's been these Classix Nouveaux albums, and now there's a Sal Solo solo album, and it's got this music on it, but we're not as familiar with the story of you going into Christian music and this revelation you've had and all of that, because it's not being covered that way here. And so Music and You, for me, for the longest time, was just a love song. And as I got to know the Sal Solo story, I remember specifically hearing it on my Walkman while I was riding my bike in Chicago and realizing what that song was actually saying. And like oh my, he's talking about his relationship with God. And I remember that specifically in the moment, like it was yesterday. And I'm curious about why you would think that song has such a powerful reaction to people and how they can feel your emotions so clearly on that particular piece of music. What is it that's there that brings us so in line with you?
It's interesting that you put it that way, because I was going to say this is one of my favorite songs on this album. And so for me, it just has a feeling that no other song I've ever done does.
Yeah.
Part of it is the gospel choir is so beautiful, especially at the end where the one girl starts wailing her head off. And I could never have done that. Well, back in the day, I would have screamed it, but you know,
you would have tried.
Yeah, she had a beautiful voice. It's got all the musical elements I mentioned. It's got that brilliant funky bass from Kevin Powell. It's got the percussion from Dinesh. And it's got a kind of soul to it, which a lot of my music has never had. And so I appreciate all those things. But I think what you're describing is correct. That, again, I was not trying to be a kind of ram it over your head kind of person. I was always very aware that people who come to faith have to come to faith in their own way, in their own time, in their own place. And it's not so much the preaching or threatening people, hellfire, brimstone. It's just simply the witness of your life. That if people see that you are happy, like the guy in my band who said, I hope it happens to me one day. He obviously observed, as I think all my band members did, that I suddenly was more at peace and I was more accomplished because I had found my faith. And so you're quite right. What I was saying in the song was, you know, to God, I used to do it for you, for me, and now I do it for you. And not a whole lot more than that. You know, my life is music and you, and that's true. That's how my life was at the time. Like I had music and I had faith and nothing much else. And that was how I wanted to be. So I was complete. I was fulfilled. And so I think I was really expressing what I felt at that time. And so what I felt was this great peace and contentment, joy, and a feeling of having arrived. And so I think many people, when they listen to this song and they relate to it, it's either it's somebody who has achieved that same thing or somebody who is aspiring to have that in their lives. And so this gives you a little taste of how it could be for you when things are no more kind of battling in your life. I don't mean to say I'm perfect or I'm always completely happy and joyful, but overall, the direction of my life had kind of arrived at that moment.
Yeah. I'm going to guess here, I don't know, but I'm going to guess this was an easy song to write. I get the feeling listening to it, it just came out of you.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. I was in a great period of creativity at this moment, partly because I didn't have the limitations of the band anymore. Not that I consider the band as something negative, but just simply the world was my oyster. Gospel choir, you know, whatever I wanted could be in there. And because I didn't know what the future was going to be or my musical identity, it was kind of like, okay, let's go here. This is what I feel. Let's try this.
Yeah. I in my mind, what I'm thinking is that the reason I say all of this is because, like, when you're working with a dough to make a pastry, the more you overwork it, the tougher it may get. But that moment at the very beginning when you just mix the ingredients and they just set right, that's how this song sounds to me. And I could be off, but it just feels that way.
Well, I think you're right, because there are a couple of songs in this album which do feel very labored. Like, you know, we kept on trying to make them work and they didn't quite work. But the other thing about Music and You, and also I think Heartbeat, they were mixed by a very good producer at the time. I mentioned in the last episode that I worked with Alex Sadkin on the third Classix album, and it was brilliantly produced. And this particular producer who worked on this, he just managed to make a sound out of it that I couldn't have done. And it was a big eye-opener for me. So even if I put it on now on my little MacBook speakers, it sounds good. You can hear everything clearly. It's got that punch to it. It's got all the elements.
Yeah, it's a wonderful gift in this album. Anything else you want to say about it before I move on?
Well, for people watching in Britain, I do have one amusing memory, and there was a very popular TV show at the time, national TV show. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of what you would compare it to in the States. Probably in the States, the nearest thing would be something like a Jay Leno. And so I'm coming on to perform this with the gospel choir, and he was an Irishman. Terry Wogan, his name was, so they'll know him. He used to do you know him because you're a fan of the Eurovision Song Contest, and for many years he was the host of the Eurovision Song Contest. So Terry Wogan, he said, okay, our next guest, he had a great hit with a song called San Diminuano, and now here he is with his latest release. And so that's always going to be hilarious to me that it was pronounced San Damiano.
I was looking at some footage of yours from some shows you were doing in that period. And there was one I came across, a very odd show. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it. But they had you and maybe the guys from Frankie Goes to Hollywood and a whole panel sitting on couches, and you're reviewing music videos. But there's so many of you, you each only get to say like a tiny little thing about it. And I was like, who's producing this? Because a couple people, we could have had something, but it's like, oh, he's got an idea, he's got a thought, and everyone had to talk each time.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, it was Frankie Goes to Hollywood were on there. Tears for Fears was on there.
Yes,
and it was a Saturday morning show, which was ostensibly for kids, but for some odd reason, it was full of all these rock stars. And so all they wanted to do was just fit as many famous people of the moment as they possibly could on the couch, and they didn't care about anything else. But it was great.
Yeah, there must be a lot of those fun moments you can remember of interesting situations your music took you to.
Well, I think I mentioned in a previous episode that we used to appear on a lot of children's shows because there wasn't any MTV back then. There was only Top of the Pops was like 30 minutes once a week. And so there was not a lot of places that actually had bands on. And so, yeah, definitely whatever was our latest release, it was going to be exposed to the 5-year-olds before anybody else.
I think that explains a lot of what happened in the UK. No. Next song on the album is Contact.
We're making contact all over the world. We're making contact. Only say the word. We're making contact all over the world. We're making contact all over. We're making contact.
At first glance, you would think it falls in with the line of the spacey things you've talked about in other ones, and the nasty little green men and all of that. Not what you're talking about this time.
Well, this takes us back to another little period that I haven't commented about yet. And that was, well, in fact, I'll go way back even before Classix Nouveaux to give you the full story of this one. Because when I was looking for something to do, what was going to be my musical adventure that was going to bring me success, I think I told you that originally for Classix, I answered some commercials, some advertisements, classified ads, they used to call them in the music paper, Melody Maker. And so one time I saw an advertisement, it said, successful Italian band looking for singer, interesting people will be invited to Italy, expenses paid. Well, I didn't want to join an Italian band, but I thought I wouldn't mind going to Italy, expenses paid. So I sent them in my demo and my photo, and they invited me. And so when I got to the record company, it was this huge, it was kind of like EMI was for London or Capitol is in Los Angeles. You know, they had a huge building, and one floor was for manufacturing records, one was for recording, one was for publishing, and so on. So as they showed me around, everywhere they had these cutouts of their most successful band. And they kept on saying to me, so you know Rockets? And it's like, no, I don't know. Nobody's ever heard of them outside of Italy. They'd sold 1.5 million albums, and they were like a cross between Kiss and Kraftwerk. They were electronic like Kraftwerk. In fact, they're a bit like Pink Floyd too, and because they had a guitar. And they painted, they all had their head shaved like me, and they had silver paint over their faces. I guess you could say a bit Devo really as well. And they basically wore spacesuits. So I was introduced to them first at that time, and the music was not bad. And then a bit later, then they were kind of wanting to try and go international. And so that was when they got the idea to ask me if I could guest with them, because I guess they thought having a bald head was half the journey already. So I was going to fit in just fine. So I guested on 2 or 3 songs, I think, on what was their album at the time. And one of them became a hit, top 20 hit in Italy. And I did a tour with them as well, actually, as their guest singer. And so I was a month in Italy, seeing all the sights and eating delicious food every day. And one of their songs was Contact. So I liked the song, and I thought, I think we'll do it. Actually, they used to play a couple of our Classix Nouveaux songs with me. They used to do Guilty, and they used to do Manitou from the 3rd album. I'm not sure if they did any others. So they did a couple of their songs, so I thought I'd do a couple of theirs, you know? And so Contact is the Classix Nouveau version of a Rockets song, except I'd written the words to it and maybe a bit of the melody, I don't remember.
Ah, that's cool. I didn't know that whole story. I mean, I know the Rockets experience and have a few of those singles and recordings, which are always fun. The song Contact, though, does feel like it fits into this whole journey at this point. And the music, the words, it feels like it fits. It doesn't feel like you brought in somebody else's hit and you're just covering it.
The way that the music worked that I did with the Rockets was usually they used to send me music tracks, or sometimes they might send me tracks with their old singer, but their whole vibe was all about being in space. So it was all about the moon and the planets and the stars and whatever. And so for me, I had an ethereal side to me, but it was more directed to the spiritual than the stellar. And so I often used to kind of adapt the words a bit.
Next up is Go Now.
We've already said goodbye. Since you gotta go, oh, you had better go now. Go now. Good now, before you see me cry.
That's a kind of piece of self-indulgence, really. But from my point of view, it's quite a successful one, oddly enough, because I have a memory from when I was very young. I have a brother and sister who are much, much older than me. So when I was a child, my sister would have on Top of the Pops, and it was only, I think it was only black and white at that time. And so the Moody Blues, before they had Justin Hayward and Nights in White Satin, they had Denny Lane, and I think their first hit was this song, Go Now. And so originally, I believe it was more like an R&B song by some American artists, but the Moody Blues made it into more of a kind of British pop song. And I just remember as a young child seeing them on Top of the Pops doing this, but they weren't performing it. It was more like a kind of very early version of a music video where their faces were coming on the screen, but they all looked a bit scary. They had big mustaches and dark hair, long hair and whatever. And it was almost a bit macabre. And so I guess that appealed to me, having gone through my Nosferatu phase. And so always at the back of my mind was that I liked this song. And I mentioned to you before that in Classix, we never did any cover versions of anything. And so I thought, okay, let's do a cover version. This is the song I want to do, but I'm going to do it radically different. So the first difference was that the original was more in a kind of waltz timing. And so I made it a straight 4/4, so it had more of a solid beat. But the second thing was that I decided to do it with an orchestra. And so the arrangement is just drums and orchestra. I didn't do the arrangement, somebody professional did the arrangement, and I love it.
Is this whole album an expensive album?
I don't think it was as expensive as Secret was, because most of the session musicians that I was working with were people I was already playing with. Maybe they were already touring with us or something like that. And it wasn't in really expensive studios. And most of it was self-produced by me. And so we weren't having to pay an expensive producer. We paid some producers to do some remixes in the end. But I don't think it was outrageously expensive.
It just has a very lush sound to it. When you've got the choirs and the orchestras and all of this coming together, it feels like a big album.
Yeah, I get that. I do get that. But I think it was kind of not wasteful. When the choirs came in, they knew what they were doing. And the string players, probably it was just a small number of them overdubbed rather than the whole big orchestra.
Final track on the album, Forever Be. You didn't list it as one of the classic songs, though to me it feels the most like a classic song. Thoughts on Forever Be?
Yeah, I think this was one that was a bit too labored, because it was almost like the parting of the old Classix thing and the indication of what I might be on my own afterwards. And so they're almost fighting with each other a little bit, because you've got the real heavy drums that I've always loved, the beats. And then you've got the boys' choir kind of drifting in that gives you a little kind of flavor of San Damiano. And then melodically, it's almost a bit more like some of those instrumentals we used to do with Classix Nouveaux, that it's got the kind of alpine folk song element to it. So for me, it's quite pleasant, but it's not one of the more successful ones that's on this album.
Yeah. In the reissue of this album as a CD, they add more tracks from work you continue to do. Was this the complete session for this album, or those other additional things we hear, are those from this same time?
You probably would have to tell me what the songs are, because
things like Metanoia.
Okay, well, I'll have to take them one by one. So Metanoia was another track that I did for the Rock Gospel show, and so it was nothing to do with the sessions for this album.
Drift Away. And I have to tell you, I have played that song probably for more people than any Classix songs, because I think it's very unexpected and wonderfully done.
Well, I really enjoy this one, because this was also done for a TV show, but not in England. It was in Romania or somewhere. And they told me there was going to be break dancers, and it was at a time when hip hop was really kind of coming in. I found it very interesting, these kind of rhythms. And so it's got, and sampling as well was just coming in. And so it was a great little sort of experiment between blending the different styles. So it's got the hip hop kind of beat to it. It's got the sample, there's give me the beat stuff going on. And it's got the gospel choir, the gospel singers in it as well to give it that soul. And so I remember doing this, performing this on TV with these breakdancers in Romania. I don't think it's on YouTube, which I'm disappointed by. I wish I could find it on YouTube. But it was done in a kind of Romanian holiday resort, and there were Polish people there, and the only thing they had in common was they could all speak Russian, because they'd all been in the Eastern Bloc. And so I guess for the Romanians, I was brand new. So they must have thought I was a hip hop artist or something. And then the Polish ones in Russian would be trying to explain to them about Classix Nouveaux and everything else. And so it was really fascinating. But I think at that time, I'm not sure I even had a record deal. So this was really very much a one-off, done quite a bit later than the Heart and Soul album. It was almost the end of my time in mainstream music. It was one of the very last things I did.
Well, it's funny to me is that you mentioned other songs, especially during Classix Nouveaux, where you felt you threw everything into it and there was just a whole lot going on. This song has everything in the world in it, but for somehow you guide it right through the track, and it's just a great audio landscape, basically.
Well, I'm trying to think of the wise saying, which isn't coming to me, but just once in a while you can get it right, you know. But I think in a sense, the idea of doing a cover version of a song which is so well known from the 70s, the whole map of it was to do it completely like it had never been done before, or never imagined, really. And so I think from the start, I had a clear notion of where I was going, and thankfully I got there in the end.
Yeah, very much so. Another song that's on there on this CD re-release, Just a Feeling.
This one is only there because of the fans. This was done as a B-side, and so a B-side back in the day was something throwaway, really, something that wasn't good enough to be on the album usually. And so my idea for this one was to do it a bit like a kind of Salvation Army band, really. And I don't know if it fully worked for me, but for some odd reason, fans really liked that song. And many times I was asked, can't we have Just a Feeling on an album, you know? And so that's why that one is there.
And I always mispronounce it. Adoramos Te.
Yeah, Adoramos Te is interesting because after the San Damiano experience, inevitably I always experimented with different sort of choral type things. And this is based upon a chant from a monastery in southern France. And what they do, it was a place, it's called Thésée, and it was started off by a monk, a Protestant monk after World War II. He just went and stood on a mountain in France and said, I'm going to pray for peace. And then other people started joining him. Some were Protestants, some were Catholics. And so they ended up with this community. And because they were all from different nations and people started going there, pilgrimages, groups with different languages, they came across the idea that instead of singing complicated songs and complicated prayers, we'll just take one phrase and we'll sing it round and round and round. And a lot of times they would do it in Latin, since that's nobody's language. And so everybody's on an equal playing field. And so I basically took this chant of theirs, Adoramos Te, and wrote a song around it. And because we didn't have email and stuff back then, I had to write them a letter asking for their permission to use it. And they gave me their permission. And that's how this came about. And actually, I did get a record deal specifically for this song. And I only did this one song with that record company.
When you're writing something like that, and I don't know if I'm using the right words here, and I don't mean offense in it, but is it inspirational and artistic, or is it mathematical? Are you thinking about structure and tempo and beat in a logical, precise manner, or is it the emotion and the mood of the music just carries you through orchestrating it or arranging it?
I think I mentioned to you before in one of the interviews that I paint. I've always been a painter before I was a musician. And so to me, music is like paintings. And so it's like you get an inspiration. I've always had a great admiration for Van Gogh, not only because of the great color and the wildness and originality of his paintings, but just there's something about his whole story and his art that just kind of beams complete creativity to me, like it's an explosion of creativity, Van Gogh painting. And I think that's why, although he was not recognized in his own time, today, so many people love the starry skies and all the different things, you know, that we know of his. So for me, music is like that I don't really think about the mathematics so much. It's like, well, what is the feelings deep inside, first of all, and how do I express that feeling? So a lot of times I cannot explain it to anybody. I've just got to do it. And so even to this day, when I'm making music, the most recent CD that I finished, it's all about the way I feel things should be. And so there's nothing logical about it. It's just I'll know when I capture it. And if I don't capture it, I'll keep on going until I do. And sometimes I never do. I ruin it along the way. But Adoramus is one that I think worked, really. And actually, the choir that's on it, they went on to start making records of their own. They were originally called Angel Voices, and these days I think they're called Libera. And they have a big following they've released albums on EMI Gold. And so they released their own version, both of San Damiano and of Adoramus too.
Last bonus track that's on the CD, and one with a really interesting story, How Was I to Know?
How was I to know all these things and never be so? You locked the door and threw away the key. I need you, but you don't need me.
I was approached by the pro-life movement, and they said, you know, what are your feelings on this? And I said, well, I never really thought about it. I was a bachelor. I'd never fathered a child. And so I'd never been in a situation to really think about this. It just seemed like that was about other people's lives. But once I started learning about it, I decided, yeah, I am pro-life. I believe in babies. I believe a baby, an unborn baby, is a human being. And but again, not wanting to be preachy, I'm not going to go and get into fights with people and arguments. And so I guess I was thinking of a kind of subtle way of presenting a message that I thought was worth hearing. Now, around that time, because I was out on my own, and because I was suddenly, in a way, I was more famous than I had been with Classix, because I was more kind of mainstream. And so I was getting all kinds of invitations. So I was invited to go to Northern Ireland. At the time, Northern Ireland was at war, essentially, with itself. And it was portrayed in the media as being Catholics versus Protestants. That's not really what it was. It's got a different history to it, but we won't go into that. Anyway, I'm Catholic. And so I made a policy that every time I would make an appearance in a Catholic setting, I would make an equal appearance with a Protestant setting, because I'm equally Catholic and equally English. And so in theory, the Catholics don't like the English, or feel the English don't like them, and the Protestants don't like Catholics. that's the I mean, I remember sitting in one group, one youth group, and some boy is going, "You English, you did this and you did that." And I said, "Well, you're holding me personally responsible, are you, for this?" So the Protestant capital of Northern Ireland is Belfast, and the Catholic capital of Northern Ireland is Derry, or Londonderry it's called. They call it Derry because they don't like the London part. So I met a guy there who had a choir, and he was blind. He'd been blinded as a young man by plastic bullets that they used to shoot in the riots. And so he was able to play guitar, you know, blind and all the rest of it. And so he introduced me to a version of this song, How Was I to Know, first of all, that was like a sort of folk song. But nobody knew who wrote it. And I tried and tried and tried to find out who'd written the original version, never did. And so I kind of rewrote it as a pop song. And because it represented an unborn baby, I sang it all in falsetto, so it sounded more innocent. And at the time, musically, it was an exciting time, because sampling was kind of coming into its own. And so I was sampling my voice. So some of the sounds, in fact, most of the sounds you hear on the record are actually my voice. So you hear this sort of ba, 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 and it's all my voice on a keyboard. And even the bass line is also my voice on the keyboard. The keyboard's going boom, 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 boom. So, you know, in a sense, you could say it was almost like an a cappella song of my voice. before people were doing that kind of thing. But I essentially wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be a political preaching song. It was just a love song from an unborn baby to the mother that didn't want the baby. That's all it was. But before it was released, people caught wind of it and tried to politicize it. So I heard of people going to record shops, or even people behind the counter saying, "You shouldn't buy this this song because it's against abortion." And even the radio stations in London would not play it. It was unofficially banned, and it really that's probably what convinced me to leave the music business, because I thought, what a bunch of hypocrites. You know, they pretend that in rock and roll music, anything goes. You can say what you want, you know, you're not restricted by convention or whatever. And with this, I discovered, yes, you are. You know, they're just as bad as any other, you know, the man or whatever you want to say. They've got their own rules and they will enforce them. And I don't want to be part of that. It's just total hypocrisy.
So through till today, basically, this was the end of your commercial music career in some ways.
Well, it was, except the Rockets called me back a couple of times. And so I did one full album with them. And then some years later, they had another revival with a different record company. So I flew to Paris and recorded some more songs with them. And today, even they also have a new version of Rockets, but I'm not part of that. So the Rockets was really the end of my relationship with the mainstream of music.
But under the name either Classix Nouveaux or Sal Solo, this closes that chapter.
It does.
Is this a good album to close it on? Was this the right one?
Yes, I think it is. There's only probably 2 songs on there that I'm not totally happy with. It sounds dated in that you can tell it's mid-80s. It's got the big heavy drums and so on that they had back then on some of the songs. But then also it has timeless classic songs. And so I think San Damiano, for anybody that ever hears that, it will always, you know, mean something to them. Probably, as you referred to, Music and You, and we could probably pick out 1 or 2 others, which are really timeless. So it was not by any means my most successful album commercially, except for San Damiano. But artistically, it definitely is up there with one of the best that I've ever done.
If Classix Nouveaux had finished out this album as their 4th album, how different do you think the sound would have been? How different of an album would it have been?
It would have been very different, because you would not have had all of the choirs for a start. You know, you probably wouldn't have had the orchestrations, and it would have predominantly been much more heavy, much more drums throughout, probably more synthy. I mean, it's quite synthy anyway, but, you know, probably a little bit more electronic. And the messages of the songs probably would have been a little different, because they would not have been just representing me and where I was in life, but they would have been taking into account where the other members were.
I almost don't know how to say this, but we're 35, almost 40 years later. What do you want to say about what's going on now for you?
Well, we've talked about before the return of Classix with the Inside Outside 2021 was the unexpected return of Classix after many years, and the fans clamoring for new material. And so we're expecting to have a new Classix Nouveaux album in 2022. So finally, the 4th Classix album appears with a little bit of a breather in between. But it's something which is not geared to really, it's not geared to really try and have hits. It's simply us expressing what we like, where we're at today, and something for the fans.
I am thrilled to have been able to walk through all of the work that you folks did back as Classix and the solo album. Just a joy to hear these stories and understand the creative process that brought this music to all of us. And I've often said to you over the years, I cannot wait to hear new music. And when whatever comes together, I'll be right there to listen to it. and excited as the time I was in Times Square and found the Secret album and had to run home all the way back to Binghamton, New York, 3.5 hours on a bus so I could finally listen to the album. I wait with that anticipation for anything new that you're going to put out.
Well, BP watched some of these previous interviews that we did, and he said to me, that guy really knows our songs. He knows them better than we do, like all the words and everything. And so you definitely have a perspective that most people would not have, and a depth of knowledge. And so you've asked a lot of questions that I might not have anticipated and made me think about things I'd forgotten. And so it's been a great journey. Thank you.
While you say that, all I can think to myself is all the fans out there listening saying, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Of course we know these stories. So it depends where you come into it. So Sal, thank you very much. And it's been a joy.
Thank you. That was.